Okay, so let's dive into this really fascinating legal case. It's about how a simple pipeline, just quietly doing its job underground, ended up sparking this huge tax fight that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And this is the number that kicked the whole thing off, almost $1 million. I mean, can you imagine opening a letter and seeing that you suddenly owe that much? Well, that's exactly what happened to a pipeline company called First Philippine Industrial Corporation, or FPIC, when Batangas City handed them a bill for local business taxes.
Now, this seems like a pretty straightforward question, doesn't it? But the answer? Well, the answer would decide absolutely everything. This one little legal definition was the key to that massive tax bill. And it sparked a legal battle that, like I said, went all the way to the top.
So how did all this even start? It wasn't some dramatic raid or big investigation. It all started with something super routine. Back in January 1995, FPIC just went to apply for their yearly mayor's permit to operate. Standard stuff.
But before they could get that permit, the city treasurer hit them with this whopper of a tax assessment. It was based on their gross receipts from the year before, which, to be fair, was a huge number, over 181 million pesos. Now, to keep their business from grinding to a halt, FPIC paid the first chunk of it. But, and this is key, they paid it under protest. And they immediately fired back with this protest letter. Their whole argument was pretty clear. They said, hey, look, we're a transportation contractor. We're what the law calls a common carrier. We just use a pipeline instead of a fleet of trucks. And, they argued, the law specifically exempts common carriers from this kind of local tax.
Batangas City, though, they were not buying it. Not at all. From their point of view, a pipeline is just a pipe. It's not a common carrier like a bus or a ship. And so began this long, frustrating journey for FPIC through the legal system. And let me tell you, it started with a whole lot of losing.
They just kept hitting a brick wall. The city treasurer denied their protest. So they took it to the regional trial court. The court dismissed their case. Okay, so they appealed to the Court of Appeals, and what happened? The dismissal was upheld. I mean, every single time the decision went against them.
So, you're probably asking, why did they keep losing? Well, the lower courts all hung their hats on this one core legal idea. Tax exemptions are special. They're not the default. The rule is that they have to be interpreted really, really strictly. So if there's any gray area or any doubt, the decision has to go in favor of the government, the tax collector. And for these courts, a pipeline just wasn't clearly and unmistakably a common carrier in the everyday sense.
Having lost at every level, FPIC had nowhere else to go. They took their case to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. This was it, their final shot. But, incredibly, their losing streak wasn't quite over yet. Yeah, you heard that right. This is the part of the story where you'd expect a big win. But the Supreme Court initially denied their petition. At first, the High Court actually agreed with everyone else. They said a pipeline operator is a special carrier, not a common one, because it doesn't really offer its services to just anyone off the street like a bus company does. It looked like it was game over. But then, in this absolutely stunning reversal just a couple of months later, the Supreme Court granted FPIC's request to reconsider. They decided, you know what, let's take another closer look at this. The petition was reinstated, and this is where things get really interesting. It set the stage for a super deep dive into what the law actually means. So now, everything hinged on the true legal definition of a common carrier. This wasn't about what you or I might think it means. It was about what the law itself says it is. And to figure this out, the Supreme Court really put on its detective hat and zeroed in on 3 key pieces of evidence.
The whole disagreement really boiled down to these two completely different ways of looking at the same term. On one side, you had Batangas City with a very physical view. It's trucks, it's trains, it's things that move. But on the other side, you had the Civil Code, which had a much broader, more conceptual definition.
The court went right to the source, Article 1732 of the Civil Code. And if you look at the text, it focuses entirely on the service, transporting stuff for other people for money. What's really important is what it doesn't say. It doesn't mention trucks or ships or anything specific. It just says by land, water, or air. And a pipeline, well, it's definitely by land.
And this right here was probably the knockout punch, the second piece of evidence. The court looked at the actual law that governs pipelines, the Petroleum Act, and right there in black and white, it says that a pipeline operator is obliged to offer its extra space to others. Well, that sure sounds like offering their services to the public, doesn't it?
This was the clincher. It changed everything.
FPIC wasn't just arguing that they were like a common carrier. The very law that governed their existence pretty much said they were one. They were a public utility, a common carrier, by definition. Okay, so for the final clue, the court did something really cool. They dug into the historical records to see why that tax exemption even existed in the first place. They looked at what the lawmakers were actually talking about when they wrote the local government code, and their original intent was crystal clear.
And it turns out the whole reason for that exemption was to prevent double taxation. See, FPIC was already paying a 3% national tax that was specifically for common carriers. That little exemption in the local law was put there precisely so cities couldn't come along and pile another tax right on top of it. It was designed to stop the exact situation that was happening here.
All right, so let's get to the final verdict. Let's see how the Supreme Court took all these pieces, the Civil Code, the Petroleum Act, and the intent of the lawmakers, and finally solved this thing.
With these 3 points lined up, the path for the court became pretty obvious. It wasn't about what a carrier looks like. It was about what the law defines it as and what the lawmakers intended.
And so, in its final decision, the Supreme Court reversed every single one of the lower courts. It declared that, yes, legally speaking, First Philippine Industrial Corporation is a common carrier, and because of that, they are exempt from that business tax from Batangas City. You know, this case is such a great reminder that in the world of law, words and definitions are everything. A business isn't always what it looks like on the surface. The method might be weird, like a giant underground pipe, but if it functions as a public service according to the law, then that's exactly how it's treated.
And that kind of leaves us with a final question to chew on, right? How many other services that we use every single day, from our internet providers to our power companies, have this sort of hidden legal identity that completely shapes the rules they have to follow and ultimately the taxes they have to pay?